So this idea of a game form utilizing, like, essentially all of the structural directions we have been mapping out recently, or being informed by them at least, but also kind of incorporating many of them as a kind of like in kind of like maybe the kind of most flat way to think about it. It's almost like an example of a kind of a game you could make out of it, or a case. But at the same time, maybe it's a bit more than just an example. But we can be the judge of it and see where it goes. But so let's start with the name, which is a completely working title. I don't treat names and I treat names temporary until they get locked down, and they mostly get locked down by other people. But there's a couple of reasons why the name seed, because the name could be OXO, could be actually many other concepts, but maybe closest of the things that we've talked about is the OXO. But given that as this sort of label now, for now, there's some interesting thoughts of thinking about it as seed. But what the seed stands for here is something that is both kind of their OXO-like, but it's also kind of this sort of filter layer-like thing, and maybe even a bit more. But we can come to it, and maybe we'll come to through an example. So let's imagine you were playing a board game. We can pick any, like something that people know, maybe Catan. Could be chess, but like let's pick Catan with something that with a little bit of more flesh and color. Now, in terms of this game, like that in itself, that game could be treated as a seed, because the seeds are recursive. Like any piece in that game could be treated as a seeds as well. Like this same OXO-like behavior is very much present here. But opening that up, let's say you're playing this, or you're starting to play this Catan, and somebody says, actually, let's put a tarot card next to it, like randomly. And that tarot card then will affect the players however it affects, but it's the play of the Catan will be done in the color of the tarot card. It could also be that they do a whole spread, and maybe that spread is built somehow in Catanistic themes. But now what do we have? We have Catan, and then we have this tarot, and it's I think quite easy to see how the presence of those tarots would have some effect, would definitely be a filter to see the game. It's not a clear effect, but it's most likely can be substantial. Like player can of course ignore it, but it will create a different game. Now that in itself can be considered a seed as well, like Catan plus tarot. And if that is expressed, have we formed a new game? Like in this kind of almost completely disbanding the kind of sense of the work that copyright has created and moved to simply kind of source material, have we created a new game? I mean, certainly, even if we change it a little from one card to constellation, we have created a new game. And if it's expressed as a new game is created again. And all of these structures, like this Catan and then this tarot cards, can be considered a seed. So that's a very small snapshot. But let's take another snapshot. So there are all these books in this world, a lot of text. There's also a lot of conversations. So if we start from that, the seeds can have types, even multiple types. Of course, type is just, it's not forced move, but it's this sort of possibility of saying this is a type. And let's say somebody in a maybe slightly, maybe tongue-in-cheek, maybe completely seriously, forms this type called text. And then they define that they don't take too much responsibility of making an exhaustive definition that stands on a pedestal in the world, but just creates this definition that text is utilizing the type of words, which can be another type, and then builds them in chains called sentences, another type, and then forms paragraphs, creating an expression out of this model in itself. But let's say they continue the type, they could start to write over the normal, the conventional sense, and then they say, in the type of text, there are different reader roles, and they create like a questionnaire, the role of the questionnaire, and they are a role you could pick to that you constantly rewrite the text in questions. Now, this happens in the world in some senses, like certainly like somebody writes questions on the side of the text. But now this same function has been turned into slightly more playful sense. So this type called text, maybe they kind of name it as a variation of text, doesn't really matter, but like there's text. So they incorporated everything that is text in this world, but they have varied the type by, for example, adding roles, or maybe putting out completely different kind of rules, like texts are evaluated by writing new text describing them, which then creates another branch out of reading, and that becomes a type. And that now considers or inherits every text in the world, potentially. But then it has changed in its spectrum, in its scope, every text in the world into a different behavior, simply by making this type. And of course, they could make on the side like a type where they want to be really conventional and describe the type in itself. But you could have like a type called concept, and then you could define that. Or you could have a type called role, really anything here. And the same variation possibility opens up here in like mentioned with the Catan, that kind of range of variability and possibility, like mentioned with this text, like changing the type actually changes all the text in and of themselves. But now again, like let's say you put like say one book or one article, and then you put this type of text that you have made, and then you call that a seed. So that's another seed for the game. Like, and of course the seed could be also, you could say that it's actually just this text is the seed, or maybe it's a seed and then this type is a seed, but then together they form a seed. You know, like full nesting recursivity as understanding. So so what do we have at this point, like as a possibility? Like we have this sort of flexible nature of not just adoption, but redefinition, recalibration to any material. Like you could, or let's say you take an image, like any image, like, I don't know, holiday photos or interesting landscape painting. And then you define a type called tarot. And then you say in that type that it can take any image. And then here's some rules, like to that type, like when you have this image, you find a title, which is entitling the tarot card of that image, and then you are able to frame, like saying, I make a frame of this, I don't know, this creature or this tree in this landscape. and then you can make the move of making a description that you describe that let's say this frame of the tree is actually called this, and it's often taken to mean, I don't know, the passing of age or the expanse of age maybe, and so on. And then you can make multiple of these moves to fill in the tarot card itself. It could also have the rules of actually it's potentially for multiple players, and then anybody can make the move of title, because you can have multiple titles, like they're almost like suggestions, or the framing or the description. There could be other moves as well, but to keep it simple. So now you've taken, like, and if you make this now a seed, like the type of this tarot with these operations of these rules, and then this sort of slot of any image. Of course, it could be something else than an image, but just depends on what one wants. And you have, and you can call that a seed. So now you have a generator for, well, not only tarot cards, but certain kinds of tarot cards. It's like a generator, an engine. But then if you bring that tarot card and let's say you create this sort of type called films. I'm intentionally using this normal because I think it's interesting to invade these spaces. And then you define that films are watched by taking pictures from them and generating tarot cards out of them, like screen captures, and then continuing to watch while the cards tend to accumulate. So now you invaded, adopted, sourced any film, and then you created a new pattern of film watching, but incorporated the seed of this tarot, and then you call that a seed.
Yeah, okay,
So in this game, I put the game in quotation marks, by the way, and like I have this sort of paper-written document of this, and this is, I'm meaning to move this into other forms. So it was in the point that it kind of started to write itself out. So it's the fastest to do it this way. But so we have this sort of, so it's a small, it can be a small, modest game, and but at the same time, it's a game that suddenly took everything in. Like it can, like if you make a type of text and you define text differently, like let's say you say text contains sentences, but it also contains layers. And the layers are sentences, words, or phrases that are to be read as if they were layered or filtering other text. Now, making that into a seed, once again, you have created a new form of reading in itself. So it's not just adopted everything in, it's actually kind of made everything changeable and shareable, and then the changeable form is adoptable again and incorporatable to other forms like the tarot into the film, etc. And of course, this can contain like completely new types, like you can make the type of the gene, or many versions of it, and then utilize that to create a new area. Or it treats new areas and old areas kind of the same, like they are all actually just sources. They start to behave like pure sources, like, or at least close to pure as possible, and that they start, yeah, their operational range is enabled to be a sort, to put it that way.
Yeah, I'm understanding seeds as a container that allows for plugging in, sort of for modularity. Like this is the thing, this is how it operates, and now we can sort of like use it as a building block in somewhere else.
Yes,
Does that make is that a good description?
Yeah, like that's kind of like the Lego-ness of it.
Yeah.
You could also think of flippantly that this is actually Legoization of culture, but it's like actually putting a Lego of infrastructure on top of everything in culture.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Like, and that's actually a good description because it sets the kind of elementaries. But there are other things, like as you probably know that the seed here inherits everything we talked about, the filter layer kind of thing. Like it's behaves exactly the kind of like ways we thought about them, etc. is kind of here, and it kind of incorporates the oxel. This is also why I thought this could be called oxel, like this sort of nesting quality, and in a way, like it's always kind of organizing its own space, like but of its own. But then
Yeah.
there are a couple of other points here. Is well, many, but some things that could be highlighted. Now, if one thinks of this as a game, quotation marks, so like clearly there is an interesting way to play that when you create this form of, say, this film that contains these tarot cards, that then naturally becomes a form that you can share. And then somebody could collect, let's say, different forms of these films into a type called deck, which has 10 cards. And every time they watch films, they draw a random card, which they're made into types of film watching, and they might get this. And then they watch films in this manner. So the game actually behaves more like a network rather than a cocoon or shelter or a closure as most games behave. Like it's already there. Like it just networks naturally because it's built in a network-like manner, naturally or naturally to itself, like how it's structured. So it starts to suggest these possibilities immediately. And of course, this is dependent on the fact that rather than using the conventional paradigm of games that they are made to be interesting interactions, but often not giving so much interest towards their results, here it's also the action, yes, you can design towards that, but it's also the result. Like if you, like let's say you're playing the film game with the tarot cards, and then you made some screen captures, and then you put them in tarot card game, then you make a deck out of it because it's an interesting, you came up with some interesting cards, and then you call that deck the title of the film, and then it becomes actually an alternate representation of the film that behaves like a tarot deck. So the results are, they instigate in themselves like their own sharing just by the fact that they can be potentially interesting. Not, of course, everything is interesting. That's a sure thing. It's like everything that humans produce, something is kind of just like banal, something is just normal, and something is interesting. Of course, nobody can control that, but it contains this possibility that it's driving towards interesting things, like and driving towards, in a way, like generation of new forms that are on an equal level than the rest of the game, like in terms of their possibility. Um, so these patterns are natural, but then they come naturally into this networking, because if you make the deck from that film, let's say, I don't know, you watch the, I don't know, The Mask of Red Death, the old Vincent Price film, just for the, to pick an example, and you made the screenshots, but you made these cards, and which you then use to watch the further in the film, which then change the film and probably change the cards. But then you make this deck, and then you have this deck of Mask of the Red Death, which is based on the film, and you have kind of played, let's say, with this rule of the title and the framing and the description, therefore maybe written on some cards, and that becomes like a game form in itself that some people play, and they start playing that as a normal tarot, like, or something similar to that, and that's actually their seed that they maybe repeatedly visit. So yeah. So while it's simple, but there is possibility, like the possibilities that it opens are rather interesting.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds to me like yeah, like an oxel with inherent filter-like qualities, but there's also a lot of at least from this example, a lot of ops from type, right? Like
Yeah.
you have this, let's say tarot is the mold, and then you're gonna make types of tarot cards, and that just needs an input, in this case the film, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of like yes, you said an engine, which is a word we've used but haven't really defined, I guess, or yeah. So I guess this is starting to, I don't know if we want to go that route, but it is really powerful in terms of engines as typers in action. And yeah, makes a lot of sense. Like it's a really powerful setting, right?
Yeah.
And you could turn, I don't know, maybe if you have chess as the setting, and then you can watch the film, and instead of creating tarot cards, you create chess pieces.
Yes.
Right? Okay,
Yeah.
this piece can move 2 squares every 2 turns or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like really hesitating.
Yeah.
Based on a character of the movie, right? Like,
Yeah.
I see it as very as a very useful framework for both hacking games, like playing with existing structures, tarot or chess in these 2 examples, but also as particular way of understanding media, right? Like watching a film with the purpose of creating the tarot cards or the chess pieces really filters your experience of watching.
Yeah.
And yeah, it indicates a certain way in which you approach it, right? With which it's interesting in its own way.
Yeah, and even like if one takes the example of the chess that you just described, making chess pieces, and then somebody brings in, say that there is an like a adds an additional operation that every time you do a move, you tell one sentence of the story of what's happening in itself, and then makes that a seed. Now, one could call these like that. These kind of things are, say, hacks of chess, like these exist, and that's certainly true. But what's happening here is that there's suddenly a network protocol. There's a weird, slightly tongue-in-cheek, slightly cold, but I think an interesting perspective towards. There's a network protocol where that form, as a seed, can travel and meet other forms of in itself. Like it's suddenly in a network by the nature of the seed. So in some ways, it's an engine, but it's also kind of in a weird way networking protocol. Of course, as a protocol, it behaves more like a humane protocol or human protocol in like it has this softness, like intentionally so, because it's the strength of humans. Like, but it also has certain kind of rule-like tendencies to enable itself. Just that the rules are more bendy because this is something of a strength of humans that they can utilize and also deal with. And so, and it's of course like everything that is generated from it with it becomes like part of the game itself. Like if the game would be a kind of a treasury or library, or its content, you can think of it in terms of its content. Like if somebody creates this whatever of these mentioned forms, it kind of grows the game of the seed itself. Just like you would set an internet protocol, and then the internet would actually be richer because people put stuff in there, and like it's kind of the same. So there is many behaviors that kind of resemble a networking protocol, but it's also kind of like, let's say, tuned into the kind of human communication itself. And it also offers kind of interesting specializations. What if one actually, like in some ways it's just so unconventional that people don't usually start treating the whole of language as variations. People might create artificial languages, but like there's rarely this vision that I actually change everything that is already existing language, or how it's treated, like how it's read or how it's represented, even to the point that I'm being able to say that things that were written in a different manner suddenly behave in a different manner. Like, for example, now I find the layers from it. Like, even though the writer most likely didn't think of it in terms of layers. And if one continues making variations of that, you're starting to develop language or written text and the operations in written text, because it's possible in the structure, because the kind of nature of the source becomes so, I don't know, enlivened,
Yeah,
or available. Like it starts to behave like a source because the protocol kind of frames it as such.
that's malleable, right?
Yeah,
Like things
malleable.
become,
Yeah,
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 things
yeah.
become really, you get a sense that you can use them, move them,
Mm,
or yeah, make them operational.
yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I was also thinking that it would be interesting to apply these logics to the same source. So if you watch the film and then you select 10 whatevers to turn into tarot cards, and those same 10 sources you turn into chess pieces, right?
Mm,
And then you have like this, each source has different representations on different scenes,
mm,
which might be interesting. Maybe it's a game where you play, one turn is a chess game and one
mm,
turn is a tarot
mm,
card read,
yeah.
but you're using sort of
Mm,
like the same manifestation of the source each
yeah.
turn. There's like a, yeah, like a relationship between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's again very malleable.
Yeah. Also, like if one takes the concepts of, I don't know, truth and fiction, actuality and fiction, it kind of puts them on the same level. Because let's say you're creating this in the same operative level, because you're creating this new forms of reading, say, or whatever this form of film watching, and whether you're right, this is the form of film watching generally, or this is a variant of the normal film watching, trying to be respectful of the actuality or not, it doesn't really matter, or functionally it doesn't really matter. Both operate, and both have the same operational capabilities. Your fictional form is just as capable of operating as the form that has actualized itself as previous practice, so to speak. It actually makes the history into previous practice, more or less, which is an interesting possibility in itself. But because of that, that's one of the reasons why the door, say, to just start to uh, redevelop the use of language or text becomes open. It becomes open because the fiction has the same capabilities, so you can utilize um, uh, these sort of otherwise fictitious forms of your reading as just on the same level as the normal actual forms of reading, or any other topic, just that as a continuation of an example. But um, and this, of course, um, uh, like here, everything we develop, like suddenly there can be a type scene, type setting, uh, uh, type filter layer. Um, uh, uh, but it also offers this sort of possibility of putting these forms out. Like, let's say, I'll share the screen now for just to make an example, nothing grandiose. Okay, so here we go. Like this is from the last time, um, which is kind of like this sort of using an image in a sort of tarot cardy way, but actually towards the organization. So I this was my example I did. So I originally had just the image, but then I used this sort of like rules in progress, like making them as I was kind of processing this, like that I actually kind of pull these sort of almost organizational nuggets, like uh, where to start. Maybe here, the branching growth, like that the image sort of suggested that these roots or branches are growing out of the text, the walls, the books, the library walls. So, so then that proposed this sort of up of growth, which is like that you come up with this sort of way of treating text, of like reading it towards transformation, and then finding points when it's transforming which are interesting, and then growing foliage out of it, which is like different ops of like manipulating text to be different, and then being on the lookout for things that where these differences are interesting and making them new growth points. I think like making these things, by the way, of course, you can see the influence towards this seed itself. But then that created this idea, of course, like this was intentionally searching for exotic fragments of organization that also can maybe slot together like puzzle pieces, or at least put into the same context. So the next I made this reader and to reader sculptors that they read sources towards sculpting instruments from it. And then to develop that further would be kind of come up like how do you read towards sculpting, how do you extract, how do you shape, and how do you experiment with the shapes in itself. And then there was like I made the dog into hound of sources, which is a type of a role, which is like whenever a hard crystallization is formed out of the text, or like a sentence that is kind of meaningful but hard to crack, then people throw it on the floor, and then if somebody's the hound of sources, they can gnaw on it, and they have their own ways of gnawing, like for example rewriting it again and again, which resembles gnawing, and or some other behavior. So like that is sort of weird and unusual, but it's an interesting idea in itself, and those ideas couldn't have been born without actually kind of utilizing the framing of this image, or the presence of this image as a source. Like you're starting to see how this is organized. There's this relation to this text. There's the readers that become a role to develop on this, different roles that then expand the range. There was also like, because it seemed like the building is, or the walls of the room seemed to be the text themselves, or the shelves. Like how do you construct rooms from sources, like text or something else? Like maybe they're abstractly formed out of that. And this is maybe an approach that this still fragmentary sense of an organization has, but then part of the play would be figuring out how that happens. Anyway, this is a kind of fleshed out example. Now, of course, like coming with this and maybe kind of naming these techniques, this is an op in itself, which you could relate to, I don't know, even tarots or something like this, but also to other things. So it's also a form where one can adopt, but one can also create completely new. You could also, like, let's say you were using an image that is completely your own, and they're using this for it, or even some new media that people haven't thought of. So none of your pieces is in a way adopting in this sense, but it can fit with this formation of the seed itself.
Yeah, this is really interesting. The taking the source and then extracting features from it that that become seeds or oxels in themselves. Again, that's a game in itself that also creates these modules for further exploration, playing, interoperability. Again, It's really nice.
But that's a one. I mean, there's now many examples, and that's one example among others. But that's let's say that's the basics of it. That's like setting let's say the principles of the Lego set. It's like this is like how one the idea of like the Legos having each one having this sort of connecting points, and of course one could detail those down, but it's essentially kind of summarily describing how the Lego set forms. But of course, like with Lego, there is a lot that kind of extends from there, which is both like, I mean, you can think about the Lego recipes and templates and different things built out of Lego and things like this, and different practices around that and so on. So around this seed, there is a lot of possibilities, of course, there. Like you can build, like Lego, it's a culture. Like it's a protocol that forms a culture in itself, like a subculture. This game can have a culture as well. It's just a matter of if it's being played in itself. Like for example, if Lego building has a culture of like making different forms of out of Legos, like here the culture could be like some group starts to develop I don't know, like using the earlier examples, different ways of film watching, and they come up with a new way of film watching every time, and then somebody starts to follow that in order to watch films differently, and then kind of makes variants out of that. That becomes in itself like an element of culture itself, and like one could start now from any point. That's the text example, this sort of card examples, like really even like things like drawing, etc. All of this can be like any of these can be a starting point. So, but I thought about like also to a little bit imagine the kind of potential, other potential that is there is um, we can also think of like the concept of growth itself, like um, um, like because there are some interesting possibilities that open from there. Like one of the reasons why seeds behave like filters is because their nature is to grow, to have their impact on the world, and that growth is uh, always dependent on both the seed itself and its genetics and the environment. So in a way, like that's a filter-like nature in the seed, because um, while it has its own starting point, it still grows into something that is affected by the environment, a little bit like the filter affects the environment by bringing a color, but the environment affects it, and the same happens with the seed. But and also, seed treats the environment in the widest sense like a source, like that's its nutrition, and nutrition in the sense that it becomes incorporated into the thing that the seed changes, how it grows, which is also like a behavior actually quite visible here. That like this kind of approach reflects that behavior as well. Like the seeds that are made by this are like if it takes the film and then it takes the card making, it's treating that like like it's like setting the sources of nutrition, but then it suggests that it can take other films, of course, and that's another source of nutrition. It's like a certain plant needing, I don't know, magnesium or copper. It's similarly saying like, oh, I can take this in. But they also suggest their own mutations or variations, like immediately, like that potential of mutation is in these kind of seeds, as we tend to kind of reflect back to anything biological, including the seeds themselves. And then I mean, one can go deeper from there. It's like one interesting thing about seeds growing is actually when they expand to the environment, like growing, I don't know, roots, most likely, it's all relation building, because they form a relation of support from one part of a soil and a support from another part of a soil, etc. So that they're relating itself to the world by growing, which is another interesting point there. And while I don't think that these are necessary, it's actually the kind of the basic structuring that more makes it. This also allows to maybe think other possibilities or further possibilities from this sort of structuring itself. But yeah, like I have other pieces, but maybe like that I don't spend time talking once again too long. I was thinking like maybe try to intentionally open this up, and if we have this Lego set, this seed, and we have actually kind of introduced Lego set / network protocol / engine to culture itself that actually reconfigures the position of every existing culture or new culture and puts them in a different operative position. What could be done with it? What should be done with it?
Can you give another example of this? Like, what are you expecting to happen, or what are you looking for?
Well, if one thinks about it practically, like, of course, like one way to, like what happens when somebody creates a new network protocol is that they first try to lure some people to put content on that protocol. Like somebody came up with, well, Tim Berners-Lee came up with HTTP by copying the, or taking the approaches of hypertext, etc. One doesn't have to go to that history. But anyway, like then there's the proposal of the protocol, but then the key point is actually somebody making something with that proposal. And then usually they often start by making something themselves and trying to get other people to make also things, and also implementing in the practice of that. So one thing is, of course, like any of these examples could be forms that are present here. Like let's say there is 5 practices of reading or 10 practices of watching films, which have the interest of both being actual, let's call it playable forms, like operational forms, but we can call them playable forms. But at the same time, they are examples of what happens to culture when it's put into this form in itself. So so they are interesting content. Like the playable forms is almost like people visiting the a website, but then seeing the source code of that website is and how it's made is a way to instruct you that you can make them yourself. And of course, because website code can be copied, these can be copied. Like you actually make your own form of watching a film or making tarot cards or reading text or like really anything, like walking styles, like new ways of conceiving cities or cities versus nations. Like you can pick any topic. So you can kind of copy parts of it and make your own version of any of the existing things, and then make your own versions after that. All of those possibilities come to play. So I think, like, on some level, there would have to be that. There would have to be this sort of opening of these possibilities in concrete cases, one can think of them as examples of seeds, but I would like to think of them almost like cases, and that the cases open up this play, both of a particular seed, but also making of them. But that's just one thing. I think like there are many other things, and this is also an area of development. Is like, what do you do when you have the system? And here I could use the web pages again. When there was HTTP, I mean, there was an awareness that you can do a lot with it. I mean, it was a pretty good protocol in terms of being a flexible version of hypertext that it was actually implementable. So there was this awareness that, hey, a lot of things could happen. But then the first things that people made with it were kind of somewhat clunky. It actually developed over time of what can you do with this paradigm. But of course, like pushing that as a development is part of this as well. Like because just like web pages actually created their recalibration of culture and including new forms, this has actually just the same potential. Like, what if there is like suddenly there's this possibility of creating new ways of reading or defining what text is, that can form a culture that actually people start utilizing even mostly these new forms of reading or new forms of text, and then they start writing text along those lines. Then you're into the area of how just like web pages became from a structural form into examples of that form, into forms of culture themselves, and then started reconfiguring culture by both changing culture as it is and adding to the culture. All of that as a pathway is possible for this form.
Do you conceptualize seeds always as akin to protocols, in the sense that they always have the capacity to replicate things through a process or to generate new things through a process? Is that the defining characteristic of a seed?
Actually, how to define it, you could define it in many ways. And this is part of the game in itself. If there is no the type of reading, is there the type of seed? No. So if it's a recursive structure, it means it can redefine itself, which is only logical. Like, if one thinks in recursive structure, it's only logical. Like, somebody can make a type of seed, like say the whole game, and redefine the game. So that's something to be acknowledged. Of course, it's good to define it, and you can create definitions of it, but the definitions or the contents of that seed that define it can always change, or there can always be alternatives to it, and new alternatives can be created. You can also redefine the type. Like, there should be a type of a type, and then you can create another type of a type, and the same thing applies. So I have some stabs on how to define the seed, certainly taking into account that it's not the culminative, exhaustive. It's not the exhaustive definition, but like a lot of that comes from almost like taking as is some of the behavioral patterns from the oxel idea and some of the behavioral patterns of this filter layer type idea, and just putting them in itself. Like, and of course it's also like you can take certain behaviors from the concept of framing. It is actually a kind of application, like concept of framing taken into high flexibility. Like actually reading what framing, if one really starts purely from it, what happens with that? That's so those directions would be, especially for pragmatic reasons, because people will ask that question, what is a seed? Then for pragmatic reasons, those would be things that kind of fill that void or fill that question.
Yeah, yeah, I see that. Still hard to grasp in its openness. It's like always eluding definition, right?
Yeah, but it's kind of part of it. That's how it treats all definition. So it's very much kind of logical to itself. Um, that that's kind of how it plays. That and it, of course, it's sensible that it extends to itself. Like it's just part of the play in itself. Like once again, if you take recursively seriously or purely, then this is kind of true in itself. Like the system that establishes the recursion is susceptible to the recursion itself.
Yeah.
And the system that establishes the variation possibility and this nature of a source and seed is susceptible to the nature of the source and seed itself. And all the parts that make it, like a type, etc., are similarly susceptible.
Do you remember 2 sessions ago we had this non-rivalrous metabolic cheese card making factory?
Yes.
Where there was the original cheese and then it went into a scene and then filtered. Would you categorize that whole process as a seed? Is that helpful? Like, was that a seed?
Well, first of all, like anything can be categorized as seed,
Okay,
but yes, but also I think it's a useful thing to think of as a seed. Like the key point here is like if one, like anything can be categorized as seed, but maybe some seeds are more fertile than others. That's a way to think about it. So you're looking for the fertility, and the, let's call it, the best practices or good practices towards this game is to learn where like fertile seeds are formed. And and towards that kind of thinking, for example, you can think of any game as a kind of a seed in itself, like because game is a generator, first of all, like in this sense, like and maybe another way to think about it is like you can make a seed out of a text, like a book, but what it instigates you to do is to add the operation in, explicate the operation in. Like in a way, book kind of contains its own operation, like reading, but it's often a silent. It's like default. It's unexpressed, like that there's this assumption that there is reading, but it's not expressed in itself, like how to use it. It doesn't have a manual for it. Whereas the seed would be more naturally that it would be the text and then the practice upon it. And then also it treats slots and instances the same. And what I mean by that is that it could say, like the film practice, can say put any film here, or it can say put this particular film here. But both work equally. Because it kind of means that the slot is kind of a type, or everything is at the same time potentially a type or an instance. Actually, the one concept I should have talked about is kind of like there's a particular relation to instance and instancing here constantly. Like in a way, it's like you're constantly moving in potential type, and you can potentially instance out of it. And when you instance out of it, you can call that a seed. Like yeah. So yeah, like that's the but I do think those practical examples earlier, like how how a game is naturally a seed, and if you take, say, a text, but then you add the kind of way of reading to it, or potential ways of reading, then you're kind of easily in the seed. Like uh, if you include the operation into it, um, that's a more fertile seed-like thing in itself. And of course, you can include it by inheriting. Like you say this book and then this reading seed made by somebody else, and then
Mhm.
you include that seed into the seed, because nesting and
Yeah.
recursive.
In very traditional perspectivist fashion, everything
Mm,
can be everything, and
yes,
it's just a matter of when
exactly.
is it useful to frame it as such, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Um, and I think uh, like underneath there's actually, like, let me if I would kind of summarize what I find really interesting here is that once again now there is something that is very simple at its core. Like, I mean, of course, it benefits and needs some of these sort of descriptions, etc., in like to give it to other people, etc. And it would definitely benefit from having cases, instances, examples, call them whatever, to actually make it more understandable. But it doesn't remove that ultimately what's at the core of the system is actually super simple. But at the same time, that simplicity has kind of incorporated almost everything we have conversed: the perspectivism, the instancing, the potential and actual, the type as a nature, and then this sort of variation, how to treat everything as a moldable source or changeable source, how to start play from anywhere and then use your changes to make it into a new kind of a starting point, a new seed, and constantly create new starting points, and how to have high recursivity. And of course, well, one key thing is, because seeds can contain seeds, of course, they can contain structures between seeds as well. Like if you were to say, I actually like this structure where uh, it's has this kind of uh, approach to setting, and then it brings all these books, and then it brings these potential roles, and here's actually a diagram of their relation, and that's the seed. So the like the networking potential is there, and just as well seedable, so to speak.
In in a sense, I think the power of, maybe I keep just like fruitlessly trying to define the seed when I shouldn't, but sort of like this capacity of extracting or identifying and then formalizing some behavior that can be contained and applied to other things. Like I see maybe seeds have this potential of growth. When you frame something as a seed, you make it operational structure maybe, or you
Mm-hmm.
imply the potential of, yeah, how it operates to further
Yeah.
replicate. Maybe there's like a need for seeds to replicate or to create type and variations.
No, I think you're on the right track in general. Like, and why I like the seed, even though I kind of felt that bad about introducing yet another seed, another term. Although seed was on my list of alternative terms for filter layer, and I even underlined it. Like, but the reason why I kept it is because it had some interesting connotations. And one of the key interesting connotations was this inherent relation to growth. And why I would kind of go by the path of growth first, growth is kind of essential, then looking at replication maybe later, is because growth is actually an interesting factor because it means mutation. So you start from this process, like a setup point, and then to grow, it kind of permutates itself and extends itself. And I think that's the key quality is now one thing one could immediately put on that quality, that any point of that growth could be made into a seed again. It's like you could say, like, this game is the seed, and then you start playing it, and then after two rounds it's in an interesting position, and then you say, actually this game 2 rounds in is the seed. That's always a possibility in itself. Like, once again, this sort of reading framing as to the extent of its flexibility as a concept, but or as an operation, really. But then at the same time, like, you can think of, if we use the game as an example, or any game, like, what, like, I think it's quite possible and quite sensible to think about what happens in a game that you make, a board game, you make it set up, and then you start making these moves. It is a kind of a growth, especially if you think about it in time and permutations. It's like if you would draw a graph of permutations, it would be almost like drawing this sort of a root growing out of the seed itself. So I think it's quite sensible to think about this sort of permutations as a form of growth in itself. And of course, like, making variations to it is another kind of a growth in itself. So they all kind of fit this idea of, like, growth being always there. And to touch upon a can of worms, only touch because it's a big can of worms, is that, like, if you think of concepts or even thoughts, like, the natural quality of a thought is that, yes, we have these forms that we use to share concepts, for example, like we give them words, which is actually kind of like, okay, let's start with the premise or perspective that one of the main reasons to make them into words is to be able to frame them. And why do we need this ability to frame them? Because they naturally never stop growing or flowing. So when you start thinking of a concept, the flow or growth appears immediately. It doesn't stay still. It's like, oh, this thought and that thought and this thought and that thought. And then to actually kind of write out of it, you need to frame it out again to lock it into a word, like, that you're putting as part of a text. But then when somebody starts reading that framed thing, let's say you've made a phrase or a text out of your words, they start flowing immediately, even if they read just one word out of it. Like, they cannot make it to stay still. So there's this constant growth, constant flow in growing direction out of these points. So why I wanted to touch upon this can of worms, which is like how the relation of semantic and human processing, which is about the largest can of worms you could about touch, and is because I don't think it's an accident that this is reflecting these core operations, that we need the framing actually to stop, because the natural point is actually not the stop form, but it's the flow form. And this reflected by simply the fact of what happens to words, what happens to concepts, what happens to thoughts by their nature, is that they have this sort of flow which can be thought of as growth, as the natural pattern. So this is why we need the stopping, but we sometimes become almost blind to the fact that that stop form is actually like more this tool than anything else. Like how to like summarize this part, that they kind of like they're more like operative necessity than some kind of an container of meaning, container of essence. Yeah, like
Yeah, this reminds me of something I've always thought of about, like how words in like dictionaries is the place words go to die, basically, because they stop flowing through human language. They just become crystallized, and yeah, their evolution is stopped in the dictionary. Like, it's better to just ask around what a word means. You probably will get a better sense of it. But also how this crystallization, or this framing, or this containing something in a descriptive format, allows you to more easily build structures, whereas when things are flowing, that's a bit more difficult, which I think is something that happens with rules. Like, we formalize some soft things into a more rigid structure. That is, of course, a spectrum from soft to rigid, but then you allow yourself to build something upon that. So I guess seeds can have a bit of both of those in their structure. Like, they can be rigid at a certain point, and then again become soft again, and evolve, and then fall back to a malleable state, and then to a structural state. Like, I'm thinking of the different manifestations of seeds and their use in our ontology. Like, when are they useful? I guess is my question. When is it useful to contain something as a seed instead of an oxo, for example?
Well, the key thing towards that is um, they're useful to contain a seed if there is a benefit of that network structure. Why is your text interesting to make it into a website? Like, we can go back to the kind of example of almost like an early web. It's because there is something interesting in that network structure in itself. Like, it could be the same text that exists also in a book, but you also put it in the web. Why? Because of the network structure and the kind of relations that it can create. And the same applies here. It's like, so the one thing here is like, one can define many networking structures, instances towards this, like already, and package them as seeds again. Like, yes, it's once again recursive in this sense. Um, um, but it doesn't actually need to say that it has one particular networking structure, because it's capable of adopting many. Like, I'm meaning like precise network rules. It doesn't have to lock in that these are the only rules that seeds relate, because it's capable of expressing many ways the seeds relating, and therefore forming new networks out of this possibility itself. And maybe the best way to, well, maybe not the best, but a way to think about this is that there is actually a lot of overlap or similarity between seed and a word, or let's say word concept. Like, because they all always kind of function like a pair. It's a complex pair, and it's difficult to describe or define this pair to some kind of sensible combination. But we can now simply think of the word concept. Like, how does one define a word or word concept? Is actually kind of tricky thing. It's a kind of very simple thing. Uh, but at the same time, like, it's harder to give it like a full definition. But the seed is kind of behaving in the same manner. It has kind of similar relation to its own definition in itself. And I don't think that's an accident either, because it has this sort of similar capabilities as a word or concept has, a word concept, to organize culture. But what it has recalibrated or formed differently is the contents of the seed in itself. And you could say this is different in the convention. There's a little bit of difference in relation as well, but that in itself is actually a quite huge difference. Like it's almost like seeds were like word concepts for a world or a culture that conceives itself ultimately as play, sort of. Um, I mean, that's one way to think about it.
That was really, really beautiful. You should write that down.
It's recorded now. I
Yeah.
should put it into a seed.
Yeah.
And then it can be put into a seed archive like dictionary.
Into a seed vault.
Yeah. And I think that is like, while I could, like I said, like one could write a long description or definition. Maybe I even would more call it a description rather than a definition, because I think it fits better maybe. Like containing those things said earlier, like how to take all the structural things we talked about, the oxo, and what we talked about, the behavior like a filter and like a layer, and then like all the other possibilities we've thought about, like also this framing and framing as the basic operation, but then also like actually understanding that what is the operation of framing and what is the result of framing, like what kind of results does a framing give.
Yeah.
And all of those I think are useful and should be written down, but then they should not be treated as like definition, like in the like exhaustive definition, but rather more like fleshing out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. My pedestrian need or preoccupation, I guess. I guess it's the constant is just how to communicate this in a way that it's
Yeah,
usable by others, that it both has this perspectivist, open-ended approach, yet it is modular, actionable, and operational, right? Like how to do that in, I mean, I guess it's just a challenge of communication, but if everyone has to watch 1 year of XORG videos to understand this, we're doomed.
yeah. I'm more hopeful on that. Like that's a possibility, but we're more hopeful on that. So I I share your interest. I think that's the point. Like um uh I think it's good to highlight this this kind of pureness as a starting point, especially inside this group or when we are talking. Like it's good to highlight this pureness, the kind of potential of it, but at the same time, then to actually share it, it has to kind of come down from the pureness and put itself in the forms. But I do think there are pathways towards that. So, like for example, if you describe this sort of pattern that, okay, I'll use the earlier examples because like too much in the brain to think of new examples at the same time. Like this example of like somebody defines films as this sort of like making these tarot cards, but then they use a type of a tarot that somebody else has made, or maybe precisely this practice of making the title and making the frame, like taking screenshot, but then giving that screenshot a title, framing some element in the screenshot, and then describing them and framing another element, and then developing the card from there. So they incorporated that seed into that and then they form this form of films, including the operation of them, this watching. But then that naturally is then a generator of cards, which are then produced from there. So, and then somebody actually kind of utilizes that to generate these cards, and suddenly there is this library of screenshots that are turned into tarot cards. And then somebody like finds them interesting and starts to find these new suits, which is not anymore like wands and coins and or whatever, but kind of actually, and starts to organize them that way. And then somebody comes a way of using these tarot card like things with new suits, uh, and then uh, and so the track goes to flesh out for people that possibility, which is a like yeah, it's hard. It's a different way of operating with culture.
Yeah.
That's I mean, there are many ways one can crystallize it, but that's definitely one crystallization. It offers you an alternate way of operating with culture that it's at its heart, it's play.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
offers the kind of surfacing that that enables this play.
Yeah. And one thing I was thinking in terms of how to communicate, just like the tone and the language, like I think we could benefit from having a mixture, and I think that has happened quite a few times, a mixture of poetic, provocative language, and also technical, explicit rule language combined into the two. Like it is
Yeah,
definitely a contrast, and one could think they contradict each other, but of course they don't. And many beautiful things have happened in that intersection, sort of like the definition of the setting when we were talking about
yeah,
settings as the
yeah.
settings in your phone, but as the setting in a novel. It happens a lot in games, that there's like a folk culture around it, and there's also like very explicit ways in which it operates. So that's in terms of tone. And then I guess, as you said, there's also a need to communicate through play itself, like through examples. But yeah, thinking of an approach to culture that is playable, I think that really, yeah, that's a very good synthesis.
Yeah. And notice if you compare this to the earlier idea that we could publish everything as cards, and how that kind of opened this door, like, okay, you describe anomaly mining, but rather than being, like this concept book, it's actually a card, and how that opens up. Like, this is that same idea open up further.
Yes.
Like, it's like an evolution from that idea. It contains all of that. And definitely contains this sort of, like, to communicate it would contain, like what said earlier, these pathways of describing of what could it look like if culture is operated as play, and what is enabled towards that through this, like this path from the movies to tarot cards to somebody making suits, somebody making reading, like, and so it goes. The chain could continue and branch out endlessly, but all of that is kind of creating something new. It contains that, but it would definitely contain us making bad websites, like the awkward early websites, meaning making bad seeds or awkward seeds. And what I mean by that is, like, whenever there is a kind of a new protocol that opens up a new expression, the first forms have to be kind of awkward because they don't understand the potential. Um, um, but you have to go through that, like, so. But I'm thinking of that as kind of I don't know, a liberating thought, because it doesn't mean that we have to make the best seeds ever.
Yeah. Do you feel the card format is too restrictive?
No, I mean, certainly can be. Like,
Hmm.
the more, it's more like this is cards plus more flexibility and a
Yeah.
more clear sense of the protocol around it. The networking possibilities
Yeah.
is much more, like, now the card is not just kind of it's an interesting unit, like a knot point, but it's kind of floating in emptiness as an idea. Like, of course, one can think of decks and so on,
Yeah.
but here the actual relations are like seeds as well. So, like, it's very much like you could think of it as a 2.0, but even 1.3 out of the card idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, like this seed in itself. Um,
Yeah.
so, like in this sense, certainly, like a card form can be a seed. Card plus description can be a seed. Of course, just the text can be a seed. And also like the sort of practice of slotting and typing, which are kind of good practices here in general. Like the card containing text might actually kind of require the input of, say, a film or a text or whatever, like images to actually kind of activate itself. That's a kind of a slot practice. Um, um, so, and the type, of course, is that everything can be turned into a type, like like in the conventional culture, game is considered a type, and it sort of happens that the game two moves in. Somebody can make a type of that and call it, I don't know, a chess hack. But usually culture is kind of doesn't go all the way with that. But this kind of just brings them to the same level. The game two moves in is just as much a type as the original game is,
Yeah.
because it kind of is. It's just like this sort of residue of giving too much um, like worship to the concept of work and concepts of copyright, etc., that is holding us back from this thought, because behaviorally and operationally it's the same thing.
Yes.
So it's kind of like if there was the death of the author, maybe it could be the death of the work.
Yeah. Yeah. The death of the format, maybe, or of the, not necessarily the format, but the edges around the format.
Yeah, it's kind of like, in some ways it's like, I know all these ways of thinking of it is interesting, like the death of the work in a tongue-in-cheek way. But it's also like, it's, if I think of format, I would say format is dead, long live the format.
Yeah.
Because that's how it's treating format, because it's actually kind of like introducing format to actually expand what a format can do, like or expanding the possibility of formatting. Like, because you can also think about it that you can make uh, the game two moves into a seed is kind of like almost expanding your formatting powers at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's why maybe the thing that needs to be critiqued is the boundaries of the format. Not the format itself is useful. It's just
Yeah,
the limiting of it.
yeah, exactly. Like it's kind of saying that the format is really it's like a form of expression and ultimately a suggestion. It's not ontological. It's a suggestive power in itself. Like but I mean, this is playing a lot with formatting, because also the possibility of a type is just this notion, which is very much a formatting notion. Um, uh, like in a way, type is, but it's mostly doing it as like a constant possibility. Like, oh, there's always this possibility of raising something into a type. Mm. Uh, and I do think, like, while you don't have to do it, there is, I think, several reasons why there is like the term seed and why there is the term type, that they do slightly different things. It's
Yeah.
and because then the type is also, it's a different kind of creativity. Like, of course, you can say, like when you say somewhere a type row, that allows you to bring this whole family, or not just bring the whole family, but also open up a family, that the family can be now filled. Like, okay, there's like, and it also allows to set qualities to that family, like how does it behave. But there can be many types called role, and of course you could, if one wanted to, one I think actual structuring possibility is to create almost like title variations. It's like if you make yet another variant of the type called role or type of called film, then you might want to name it in a way that it's locatable.
Yeah.
But that's one kind of a practical thing that lies here, more towards the kind of practical usability.
I will try one last stab at pinpointing down the seed.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe with this last thing you said, I'm imagining, let's say, the scene is to the setting what the type is to the seed.
That's an interesting,
as the setting being a network of scenes, maybe the seed is a network of types. I mean, not only, right, but maybe that is bringing some clarity to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's let me think through it, like because I think it has potential. I'm writing it down. Yeah, that there is overlap. Of course, there are differences as well, but there is like a yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about it. Like in this sense of, okay, one way to think about this. Seed is instancing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's actually a kind of very pure. Like if we think of instancing as an operation, what can we do with it?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of it can, by the way, also instance a type. But the key thing here is that something is flowing, growing. This flow grow is an interesting thought. Like a place or continuing, thoughts are continuing, um, and therefore flowing and growing. If you instance from there, seed is kind of one way to operate that, create that operation. Um, uh, and type is categorizing.
Mm.
But it's also like forming like an origin point of a category. It can be a category that is already fulfilled or partially filled or completely empty, but it's saying here is a category or a family. Like family in this wider sense, like if one thinks of what does it really entail that something is family, like familial, which is related in a particular manner. That's so that's one way to think about this, which I think sort of touches upon your relation, this instancing and categorizing. But I also see as a kind of, to bring this sort of ways to present this, share this, is that it's a kind of an interesting proposal to propose this as a game. And I'm thinking constantly that it's game in quotation marks. And it's kind of actually an interesting play. It's both saying it's a game, but it's kind of slightly questioning. It's because it immediately creates this sort of interesting dialectic between what a game is. Because like it's almost like, in some ways, it's almost like black and white difference, contrast between what game is. It's like inherently this sort of network-like relation rather than a cocoon, rather than a contour. Like an aquarium, like, which is not all games are like that, but many games are like that. This goes towards the other end, but they're both playful. Like they both have this sort of playful practice, and and it is in the realm of like in a way, in a loose way of saying setting rules. It's like it is telling you here's how to play in the widest sense of that. The seed is just like a game is, and therefore it creates a sort of interesting kind of a reconception, re-observation of what a game is. Um, uh, and I think that might be interesting in terms of communicating it, because I think if people come from the door that this is like a game, but there is a question mark on that, it could also be seed a game question mark. That's another way of like if they're coming from that doorway, I think it's actually a good doorway to come in. If they kind of expect to play, I think that might be a good way of them approaching it. The kind of playfulness is the first expectation, or the kind of thing that they're looking for. Because I mean, what makes it interesting that you can not only sort of start suddenly watching films as making tarot cards, that's very playful. And that's definitely playful relation to culture. But then understanding that, oh, this system also allows me to express these kind of things. And then others to use those expressions to go to yet another playful relation to culture. And that's kind of the game, like, and that pervades the whole culture, because it's kind of like the whole thing is a filter between you and culture, including everything.
Yeah, exactly. That I was gonna say exactly that. Like a game question mark that is or proposes a filter to culture to make it playable.
Yeah. Yeah.
I propose that we, whenever we have the next session, that we could do not necessarily entirely the whole session, but brainstorm on formats.
Yes.
If cards are part of it, maybe there's also other organizational formats that allows us to communicate this. Web things, printed things, written things, drawn things, sort of like what's the realm of format that could, that this could be expressed with.
Yeah, definitely, because I mean, it's a classic poverty of riches situation, because if you would say any format now here, the answer would be yes. Is it included? Yes.
Yes.
But of course, like some seeds are more fertile and grow more interesting plants than others. So it's interesting to find, first of all, things that motivate us to develop, and things that we find fertile. So, but certainly, for example, cards. And I think also like relations that introduce something else and maybe create cards or project cards to other things, that's certainly a fertile area. That's one possibility. But I can say, like, I think that would be a good framing for the next session, because by my very early experience now, like formulating this in the last couple of days, I still think of this just a recalibration of the things that we have been thinking, like in a way, like it would never have happened in this kind of formation without this whole pathway. But anyway, like, but having been playing it with it in the last couple of days, it actually creates quite easily interesting formats, interesting seeds.
Yeah.
Like for example, like there is this sort of weird unshackling thing, which is like, oh, film, but then you take screenshots, then you make them into tarot card like things, but you actually redefine what a tarot card is, because it's just interesting. And then you pause the film, maybe you pause it where the card is, and then you also take the screenshot to retain it, but it's in the frozen on the screen. And then you're like multiple watchers are playing, and the card forms, and it's maybe written down, and so we have a screenshot and a text, so the card is made, and then the film continues. But then it's interesting to think, but how could it affect back? It's like, well, we kind of put the cards like a spread on the table in front of the film. But like, there's so many pathways I could go, but I'm currently making choices that I think are interesting, and some of those latter on that list choices I just improvised on the moment. But it's
Yeah.
leading you to interesting process spaces or play spaces. It's like, actually, this can create the cards, and it can create wholly different ways to perceive the film, interpret the film um, in itself. But if I would start to do something similar by starting, I don't know, from books of fiction or any kind of other kind of text, similar things could happen. Like, and maybe I wasn't using cards, but I was using like a mixture of text or roles. Like, okay, I'm taking text, but then I always take a role, and then there's this selection of roles, and somebody comes up with a cool role. So I find it from a website, and then I use that to read this text, and I post to people, hey, I read this text with this role, and this is what this is my description of what happened. And somebody says, hey, that sounds cool, I use the same. Once again, a lot of improvisation there, but like, and some old ideas mixed together, but interesting. But that's
Yeah.
all playful relation to culture.
Yeah. Yeah. This is yeah, this is a very valuable insight, sort of like make culture operate as play, as an objective or as a goal.
And my final tie-in to make the circle towards organization, because I think it's constantly present. It was one of my topics which I could have talked more about, but I'll say this because I think we kind of covered the area from another, is that one, I think, very valid way of thinking about this is a reorganization of culture.
Mm.
And if your first organizational idea, act, as your argument that you understand something about organization, is to reorganize the whole culture, it's a very interesting thing to do.
Yeah.
It's like because it's really about, like, culture is the treasure trove or treasure troves that we have. Like, it's the treasure trove.
Yes.
And if you find a way to reorganize it, which means that it, through its filter, things organize differently and start to behave differently, it's a very interesting act of organization as well.
Yes. Yeah, and it has been prevalent in all of our exercises. If you think
Yeah,
of
yeah,
it, like
yeah.
the games was definitely play play memes, use
Yeah,
memes and operate with them as play, right?
yeah, actually, on my list, like, of course, there's Type Gene, but one of the alternative titles was Seed a Gene.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I mean, and it's, of course, there, like I said, titles are labels, and maybe we change that. But like, even at some point, I thought calling this whole thing a Gene.
Hmm.
And that's possible. Maybe that happens, but because, of course, gene being still not empty slot, but kind of a slot that one holds a lot of definition, that is interesting in itself. Mostly, I think that it's certainly a fertile perspective to call where you say I made a seed. You could say I made a gene.
Yeah.
That is certainly possible, and it's a possibility on the list. But all of that to be taught, I think, like I said, like, I agree with your session idea, and I think the direction, and I do think, like, production of this as kind of like, almost like, to use this metaphor of the World Wide Web as a protocol, and how to open it is to give the protocol as one example, but also then flesh out instances towards that to get people understanding it, and then give people something to play, to essentially guide them into playable relation to culture is a very interesting and I think very potential direction.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Good.
I think that's. I'll stop sharing and I'll reboot my. No, it's not even scratching. No, yeah, there. No, it's bringing. It's getting worse. I think. Yeah, I can like.
That's funny that it gets worse.
I think it's some cable that has like
Yeah.
problem in its insulation.
So
Because
it's noise. It's like you think it's like yeah, just the signal is being corrupted.
yeah, because it actually, let's see if it happens. Yeah, I just removed the power cable.
Yeah. It is
So
noise.
yeah, that kind of makes it likely that there is an like if there is a hitch in insulation, which is possible because this is a yoga computer, and to reach the camera, it has to go through the hitch that can turn 180 degrees.
Yeah, that's the reason.
So, and then it's somehow close to where the power is coming in, and it's taking the kind of like jolts out of that.
Yeah.
But the fact that it has this problem sometimes kind of, or periodically kind of fails the whole camera, like maybe because the message is so corrupted that the driver breaks or whatever it is.
They probably had to make the cable super thin to pass it through the hinge or something.
Yeah,
Then it's lacking some insulation.
Yeah, that's the thing. Probably slightly broken, but that's the thing. But I think yes, I think interesting. Also interesting in thinking in terms of the summer, because if this forms to be a road where, or a field where to guide people in.
Yeah.
And then, because this is similarly very modular, potentially, how to bring people in it as the card. Like I said, this is very much the card 1.3 idea. Like forming the seed, like is really like forming a card, but with slightly more openness in terms of the form and in terms of the relation. Like one can very modularly make pieces of this, which is then fleshing out and describing what kind of playable relations to culture it opens up for people to play and to learn from.
I do think the sort of like most of what we've been doing here is create a common vocabulary to make culture playable.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge of the game is to make that vocabulary accessible.
Yeah.
Basically.
And make it kind of like so that it's kind of like the operative capabilities come.
Yeah, when I say accessible, I don't mean that you can make it easy to understand, but make it accessible as you open it up for people to use it, kind of.
Yeah, and I think it's probably to guide people in. It has some qualities of playing an instrument.
Yes.
And you also have to give them like take a violin. It's like simple things to play.
Yeah.
And then also recordings of more complex things to play, and the variation between that to understand what does it mean to play a violin and how do I start, like that combination. I think there's a lot of similarities with that.
True.
Yeah. But hey, I think we took a large thing and actually managed to build a certain summary, like a vista, and see.
I guess, yeah.
Like painting. It contains a lot of horizon, but it's still there, like a painting of a vista would be. So I call that a success. And with
Great.
that, I will I will say goodbye to the potential people and press stop in the recording.